Are you guys ready to get into the Word?
Amen.
Well, let's go to Ecclesiastes. Bill Schlegel and I finished Ecclesiastes this week. We have a couple words we want to check out and that kind of thing. But and I've got reams of commentary to write. But it's just an amazing book. And please turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And I want to start. Let's see what I want to start with. I think it's verse 8. Let's see. In starting, actually, chapter 12 is about. You know what? Let's just go take a quick look at it because it's a very interesting ending. After the whole book is talked about how tough life is or how pointless life is, and then also how we're going to face judgment at the end and that type of thing, and then how much emphasis there is on joy, that we should enjoy what we're doing now because this life is so temporary. And so then in chapter 12 verse 1 he says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them." Now, what we're going to see is there's going to be a kind of a downhill run now where he goes through some of the problems with getting old. And in order to really understand where the author of this is coming from, where the sage is coming from, what we have to do is we have to kind of pluck ourselves up out of our culture and put ourselves in the biblical culture. Because when he says, the evil days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no delight in them. And we know a lot of elderly people that really enjoy their old age. And that can tend to throw us off a little bit, because we have a world now that's very easy to move in when you're older. We have automobiles to take you from place to place. We have comfortable chairs. You want water, you go turn on a faucet. You want to take a bath, you just turn on a faucet and hot water comes out and you get in the bath. And life is very easy, even for elderly people that have lost their strength. But in the biblical world, that wasn't true. The biblical world was a very tough, very hard, very physically demanding world. The only way to get from one place to another was walk. The only way to get water into your house was to walk to the well, haul the water up out of the well, and then carry it back to your place. The only way to have a fire was for somebody to cut wood and then haul wood. And as a person became more aged, those kind of tasks became a real problem. And so instead of being a healthy, strong young man or young woman, that carrying water was no problem and carrying wood was no problem and building a fire was no problem. And one of the things that I've noticed as I've gotten older is I usually get up to pee at least once at night. That's real easy. I turn on a light so I don't fall over anything, and I go to the bathroom. But if you've ever camped and you wake up at night and it's pitch black and then you trip over the tent rope and you can't, it just, life becomes more difficult. And that's what it's talking about here. And then in verse 2, it goes on, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, as your eyes get older, the clouds return after the rain, it's much harder to see. The keepers of the house tremble, the strong men bow themselves. I'm not really sure what those are. It's probably a reference to the arms and the legs. The grinders cease because they are few. It makes it hard to eat. You're losing your teeth. Those who look out of the windows are darkened. Again, that's the eyes, losing your eyesight. Doors will be shut in the street. The sound of grinding is low. According to the biblical passages and the customs, one of the great joys of life was hearing the daily grinding of bread. That the women would get up and the young girls, and they would grind bread for the household. And it was a joyous sound because it meant people were going to eat and the kids were laughing and there was plenty of grain. But if as you get older and you can't hear, then you can't hear that. That's what it means. The sound of the grinding is low. One will rise up at the voice of a bird. Basically, there are things that frighten you. The daughters of music will be brought low. Your vocal cords start to give out. Older people, their voices aren't as strong, aren't as powerful. You'll be afraid of heights, and terrors will be in the road. We understand about the fear of falling as you get older. The terrors in the road, remember, our roads, we think of our roads, gosh, they're pretty smooth, and every once in a while you get a pothole or something. But remember that in the biblical world, nobody owned the roads. And because nobody owned the roads, nobody wanted to do anything about the roads. In fact, not only that, but people threw all their stuff on the road because nobody owned the road. So if you remember, even in the parable of Christ, he says, if the salt has lost its saltiness, it has no other use than to be thrown outside and trampled under the foot of men. Well, what is that? Oh, look, this salt doesn't work anymore. What do? Throw it in the road. So anything anybody didn't like, your bodily wastes, any household stuff you didn't like, stones from the farmer's field. So the roads were usually actually quite dangerous. And young men and women didn't have a problem. You just kind of make your way down the road. But an older person that's afraid of falling, the road becomes almost like an obstacle course. The almond tree will blossom. Likely talking about the almond tree was the first tree in the spring to come to bloom. All the other trees in Israel bloom later than the almond tree, and it bloomed bright white. It's probably talking about your hair is turned bright gray, but there are other possibilities. The grasshopper will be a burden. In other words, your strength is failing. Desire will fail. Generally, this word refers to sexual desire, although here it can also actually be the desire to keep on living. That you just basically, life is such an incredible hassle day after day, you just kind of want to give up, and we know that happens with older people. And then because man goes to his age-long home, we had quite a discussion about this because a number of versions translate this eternal home, but it's not. The standard theology of Christianity is that when you die, you go immediately to heaven or hell, which is then your supposed eternal home. And so the translators take this word and translate it eternal. That's not the meaning here. This is talking about the grave, and especially if you're writing like Solomon, 940 BC, then you're going to be in the grave a very long time, right? Till at this point, it's been almost 3,000 years. So it is an age-long home. And mourners go about the street, of course, then the person's dead. So the person has passed away. And verse 6 is pretty obscure. The silver cord is severed, the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher broken at the spring, the wheel broken at the cistern. Not really sure what all of that is talking about. It's possible the pitcher broken at the spring, if a clay pot came in contact with a dead body, then you had to break it. It could not be made clean again, Levitically clean. Verse 7, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and that's what happens to the human body. And then we have the last part of verse 7, which confuses people. And the last part of verse 7 says, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. And of course, we know what most Christian theologians do with this. They say, okay, you die, your body dies, but your spirit lives on and your spirit goes back to God. But we know from a biblical anthropology that the spirit doesn't live without the body. In other words, if the spirit could live without the body, then there would be like a gigantic, I don't know what you'd call it, I'd hate to call it a barn, but there'd be like a gigantic dormitory up in heaven where all these spirits would have to live. And because you hadn't been born yet. But if the spirit's eternal, then ever since the creation of things, God created these spirits, and so you had a spirit, and then
I've heard many people that believe that.
There are people that believe that. That's exactly right. So there's this giant spirit dormitory up in heaven, and then when your mom gives birth to you, your spirit kind of says goodbye to all in the dormitory and jumps into you. And that's and like you said, there are a lot of people that believe that, but of course that's not at all what the scripture teaches. The spirit is simply a form of life. And remember, in Hebrew, ruach is basically related to the word breath. It's related to the word breathe. and it's translated spirit or translated life or translated wind. In the Greek, spirit, as you know, is pneuma, from pneuo, the verb to blow. And spirit in both the Greek and Hebrew in their conceptualization of it was something invisible that exerted a force. And that's why, for example, the wind is ruach in Greek, and then, ruach in Hebrew, and can be pneuma in Greek, because the wind, you can't see it, but you feel it. Breathing, you can't see it, but you feel it. The life in a human body, you can't see it, but you feel it. And so all of those are related. And then the interesting thing is that, so if you will, ruach and pneuma are the umbrella words. They cover all of this type of invisible force stuff. Demons, angels, God, all these things are spirit. They're all invisible and they exert a force. And then what happens then is the specific life force that animates man and animals is a form of spirit, but because it's so specific, it gets its own name. So that becomes nephesh in Hebrew and suke in Greek, which is, we call it soul. So soul is a form of spirit because, like spirit, it's invisible and exerts a force. But soul typically is the spirit that animates a body. So when we're trying to understand here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7, when it says the spirit returns to God who gave it, one thing that should immediately jump out to us is, where's God? If you're an ancient Hebrew, where's God? Well, he's everywhere. So for your spirit to return to God, it doesn't go any place, because where you are when you die, God's there. So it's not a literal statement. It's making a generalization about God was the giver of life, and he will take that life back. He's the source of life. He harbors life, and it's not that the life itself goes on living. It just acknowledges that God is the source. Now, if we go back into Ecclesiastes and track this through, let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we'll start in verse 19. Let's see. Is it 19 I want to start at? Let's see. Let's start actually in 18. I said in my heart, as for the children of men, God tests them so that they may see that they themselves are but animals. And I know, in one sense, people get upset by this, but the fact of the matter is, the way God made animals and the way God made people to have a body and to have a life force, he made us exactly the same. And that life force is invisible, so you can call it soul, and many verses do, or you can call it spirit, and many verses do. But you've got a body, and then you've got a life force. And so humans are animals. The difference is that God gave humans unique characteristics, and specifically mental characteristics and conscience and that type of thing that allows people to be saved, but not animals. And so he says, okay, so if people are animals, then verse 19 makes sense. For the fate of the children of men and the fate of animals is one. Okay, we have the same fate. As the one dies, so the other dies. They all have one spirit, and man has no advantage over the animals, for all is pointless. What is this saying? This is saying it's really talking about, this is not talking about Holy Spirit. This is talking about the spirit that is life that you and I know of as soul. And,
so is it using nefesh there or ruach? Ruach.
What?
Is it using ruach or nefesh there?
It's using ruach.
Ruach. And that's the same in chapter 12, where we were, that
right.
They're both using ruach.
Yeah, they're both using ruach. And see, spirit is the umbrella word. It's invisible and it exerts the force. Sometimes God will call it nephesh or suke. He'll call it soul, and he'll be specific. It's just like I owned a black lab, and sometimes I would say, let me tell you about my black lab, and that's a specific. Sometimes I'd say, let me tell you about my dog. Well, you didn't say, wait a minute, dog, where did that come from? I thought you had a lab. Everybody knows that the lab is a dog. Well, sometimes God will call the life inside you spirit because it is. Sometimes he will name it specifically and call it nephesh or suke because it is. But nephesh or suke, soul, is much more specific than ruach, which is more of an umbrella word. Does that make sense? And see, if you're a native speaker, then this isn't confusing any more than it would not confuse you if I said, yeah, here's the key to my house. Just, please don't let the dog out. You wouldn't say, I didn't know you had a dog. I thought you had a black lab. You got it. If you're a native speaker, you get it. And it's the same thing here. So when he says, but what we want to do is pay attention, because when he says in verse 19, the fate of the children of men, fate of animals is one. As the one dies, so the other dies. They all have one spirit, and man has no advantage over the animals, for all is pointless. Verse 20, all go to one place. And the animals have the same spirit that we do, and when the animals die, their spirit dies, and we just acknowledge God as the giver of spirit, and it's the same thing with us. And then verse 20, all go to one place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Verse 23, and who knows the spirit of man, this life force of man, whether it goes upward, and the spirit of the animals, whether it goes downward to the earth. And it's a question mark. He's saying, I don't know, what happens with this stuff. Later on, it's just in chapter 12, it's just going to acknowledge, well, this stuff just goes back to God as the giver, and it just, he absorbs that life somehow or something like that, but it doesn't really go anywhere. The way I say it is I just say it stays in his memory. God remembers it. And then it's because, we're going to die and go back to the dust. Verse 22 then follows up. So I saw there's nothing better than a man should rejoice in his works. In other words, you're alive now, rejoice now. And let's go to Ecclesiastes 9. And in Ecclesiastes 9, kind of continuing the same kind of thing, if we start in verse 2, well, that was interesting. Let's see. Hold on just a second. My computer's, okay, there we go. So Ecclesiastes 9:2, it's the same for all. There's one event to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and to the clean and to the unclean, to him who sacrifices and to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath as he is afraid to take an oath. This is an evil that's done under the sun, that there's one event to all. And also the heart of the sons of man is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live, and after that, to the dead. For whoever is united with the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die. And then it goes on to say, but the dead do not know anything, nor do they have any more a wage, for the memory of them even the memory of them is forgotten. People forget they even lived. Also, verse 6, their love, their hatred, their envy have already perished, and they do not have any more portion forever in anything that's done under the sun. So it's pretty clear from reading this that the guy is saying, look, when you're dead, you're dead. Your spirit, your life force is gone. And it's just like the animals. It's gone. So now if we take that over to Proverbs chapter 12, when it says, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, we already read that in chapter 3, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Is he thinking here that the spirit is going to go be in heaven and party around? And the answer is no, because he just said in chapter 9, the dead don't know anything, and they don't have any more portion for anything that's done underneath the sun. So basically what we've got here is a simple recognition that God gave the spirit, and we recognize him. And when you die, whatever the life force was, it's absorbed back into God. But it's not you. It's not alive. It doesn't have a conscious and awareness, that kind of thing. You are dead. The soul life that you had died. The spirit life that you had, if you got born again, died, and your body died and returned to dust. And that's what the text is saying here. And that's one of the things that Christianity refuses to acknowledge. But if we would understand that, I mean, here, think about the force here a second. Let's say there's somebody standing beside me who believes that after he dies, he's going to go right to heaven, be with his parents, party around, get to meet Jesus Christ. And so here's Ecclesiastes, and it says, okay, right now you're alive. So enjoy your short life, because you're going to go to the dead. So enjoy your life, eat your bread with gladness of heart, drink your wine, let your garments be always with white, because your life is short and then you're going to be dead. And he's thinking, I don't have to worry so much about that. My life isn't short. I'm not going to go to the dead. Frankly, this life is pretty painful, and it's going to be a lot better after I'm dead. Then what happens is you miss the entire force of what Ecclesiastes is saying, and you miss the opportunity to really take the pleasure out of this life, because it doesn't matter as much. Whereas if we understand that it's like it says, you enjoy this life, and after that, to the dead. So it's really been an interesting and very effective, unfortunately, attack that the adversary has gotten in teaching that the dead are alive. And that's certainly not what Ecclesiastes is saying. And so then let's read on. Any questions about that? By the way, I know there's a lot of discussion about that, yeah. Okay, Timothy?
I had asked this of one of your cohorts there. Okay, I die, I'm dead. Spirit is nothing more than powers my body or something to that effect. And so I'm dead. Okay. Where do my memories go?
They're gone.
Okay, I wake up. Do I know who I am?
Yes, you do. Jesus Christ did. Lazarus did. The people that Christ raised from the dead did. The person that Elijah raised from the dead did. When God gets you up from the dead, he will get you up as you.
Well, I mean, something has to remain that has me in it, doesn't it?
No. All it has to remain is you and God's memory.
So what you're saying is, I'm going to put it into something that I understand, which is computers. I die, my operating system just went belly up. God had a backup, I guess, somewhere. And so now I'm raised up, he does a quick restore?
Well, basically, yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a funny, yes. In other words, God remembers who you were. And God gets you up just like you are, except better. Your body is better. You're physically better. You have a body like Christ's glorious body, according to Philippians 3:21.
God keeps good backups.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
the way I've always read Ecclesiastes 12:7, it says, "And the spirit returns to God who gave it." I always understood that as, and this is how other people have understood me when I say that when you're dead, you're dead. They call it soul sleeping, where your soul goes to God, but it's not conscious. It's like being put on a shelf, and then it's put back in your body, and until it's putting that back in the body, you have absolutely no consciousness of anything going on. So in essence, it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's just that it's not like you go anywhere. It's God has a wonderful big memory, and he remembers who you are, and he's also able to create the entire universe with a spoken word, so he doesn't have any problem recreating you.
It's also like sleeping. When you go to sleep, you're sleeping. You're not conscious really, unless you're dreaming, but you're not really conscious. And then you wake up and you know who you are.
Right. Yeah, it's that part. The difference is that in sleeping, you remain. You're lying there
Right.
in bed. You're in death, particularly like Abraham. I mean, by the time you die 4,000 years ago, at this stage of the game, you're just molecules.
Okay. But if God knows me, goes, okay. I'm supposed to stand before a judgment seat and account for my life.
And you will.
And I'm still going to remember everything about my life.
What I'm having a hard time understanding why it's hard for you to believe that God can reconstruct you exactly the way you are. He's God.
It's like I said, God keeps good backups. You're going to be completely 100% restored. You're going to remember everything. You're going to be you. You're going to remember your family. You're going to.
What I'm saying is that something about me, I think, has to survive. Whether it's, like the guy says, put on a shelf or something, but something about me has to remember.
You'd have to.
I mean, God is going to do this. How many billions of people is he going to do this all at the same time? And yes, I know he's God.
If I may interrupt, if that's true, then the word dead has no meaning. Dead is necros. It's dead. It's gone. It's over. It's gone.
Yeah.
Nothing remains. It's right. Dead.
Yeah. If I'm dead, I'm dead. And so
dead. Nothing remains. Nothing survives.
Okay. So do I start over? But yet at the same time, though, I've still got to stand in front of a judgment seat and account for the life before I was dead.
Because God just reanimates. God just brings it back. You know, he knows who you are. He knows who I am. He knows what I consist of. He knows my thoughts. He knows my memories. He knows what I've done, what my motivation, everything about me. I'm reconstructed.
Tim, think of it this way, okay? God started out with Adam. Now, when God made Adam, all there was dirt. There was no Adam. And yet, when God formed Adam, he didn't make a baby that then somehow or other he had to figure out how to nurse. He created Adam as a fully functional, mature human being, complete with wants, desires, language, sexual desires, control over his motor functions, the whole 9 miles. And just a few minutes before, he had been dirt. And Adam didn't get up and say, wow, how do I have motor function? How do I know how to move my hands? How do I know how to speak? Where did I learn language? God created all that stuff. They call it ex nihilo, out of nothing.
But every day God would spend with him teaching him.
Well, that's not true. There's no verse that says that.
He would walk in the garden with him in the cool of the day.
He came to talk and fellowship at the cool of the day, but there's no verse that says that God sat there and taught Adam all day long. Adam came out of the factory knowing, and if you remember, it even says that God asked Adam what to call the animals. So Adam had a very, very finely functioning mind. And you're going to die, you're going to disperse into molecules, and when the resurrection or rapture occurs, you will be put back together complete with your memories. There's no problem to understand that. Your memories are electrical impulses in a brain structure. And if you want to prove that to yourself, you just have brain damage and all of a sudden your memories disappear. It's like, gee, what happened to those memories? Well, they're gone. Why? Because the neurostructure that supported them is gone. God is going to completely restore a full neurostructure and your memories will be there. They don't have to go anyplace. It's just like Rob says, you just have to know that God can do this.
So does that make the shale it's just a idiom, an understanding that they all knew that they really didn't exist, but they talk about it as a place they go? Yeah,
the Sheol is an interesting word because it does not have an equivalent in either Greek or English. Sheol is the state of being dead. When if you ask, well, where's my father right now? My father is dead. The Hebrew would say he's in Sheol. He's in the state
with the ancestors.
Well, they would talk about it. You're going to sleep with your ancestors, but that's not where Sheol was. Sheol was the state of being dead, and the Greeks didn't have an equivalent to that at all, because the Greeks believed what the average Christian believes, that you don't die when you die. So the Greeks said that you went to Hades, but they talked about an eternal soul. That's how the eternal soul got into Christianity. You know, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 323 BC, if I remember correctly. And when he did, it took about 2 generations, and most of Egypt was speaking Greek. And that's why the Septuagint was translated in Alexandria of Egypt. And they translated the Hebrew word Sheol as Hades. And so the Hebrew-speaking Jews came to believe that the dead were alive, which is what the Pharisees believed, which is why Christ taught the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, to match the belief of the Pharisees and say, yeah, even if one came back from the dead, you wouldn't believe. But the Hebrews were very clear. When you died, you were in Sheol. The spirit was gone. The life was gone. You were just like the animals. We just read it in Ecclesiastes 3. They have one life. When they're dead, they're dead. Nobody believed that the animals lived on.
And so Sheol is not a place, it's a state of being.
That's right. Sheol is a state of being. The place.
Or a state of unbeing.
Yeah, state of unbeing. The place is Quaber, the grave. Now we do have the word grave, and that's a place. But Sheol is a state of being. That is correct. That's a good way of understanding that. Yeah.
When I just want to make a comment that that whole concept, if we didn't have any this theologian in our head, the whole concept is talking about dead and gone. So enjoy your life now, make the most out of it. That's what that's what I got out of. If I take all the other theologian out, you know what I mean? So
you're exactly right, Nina. And that was my point when I said, one of the reasons that the average Christian doesn't get Ecclesiastes is they think they're going to have a better life when they die than they do now. So it doesn't make any sense for them to have to eat and drink and enjoy their life now because they're going to die. Because to them, no matter how much they enjoy this life, it's not going to be as enjoyable as when the life that they'll have when they die. But Ecclesiastes is saying, no, you don't get it. When you die, you're dead. You have no life. So enjoy this life now. And that's the message. Gladys, did you have a question?
I have a question, yes. This is Gabriel speaking.
Gabriel, excuse me.
So when a person dies, the spirit returns to God. I understand that. But the Bible verse that says that in the name of the book of life, isn't there a scripture that says your name is in the book of life?
Yeah, there is. In fact, there's a couple of those. And that again refers to, basically it's a reference to I believe there are actually angelic scrolls with names in them. But the point is that God has a memory system. It's kind of like what Rob said about having a backup drive up there. The Bible testifies that there are angels writing down books of what people are doing. And those will be read on Judgment Day.
And that's not for Christians anyways.
Yeah, actually it is.
Is it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when God's going to reward you for all the works, the good works that you've done, and he needs evidence, and so there's angel scribes writing down all kinds of things.
Well, I'm not saying they're
not for salvation, Paul. Not for salvation.
No, not for salvation. This is for rewards.
Yeah. Christians are saved, but you bet. I mean, we're going to, what's that, 2 Corinthians 5:10? We're going to have to give account. We're going to stand exposed before God and give account for everything.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Well, that's why, what gospel is we're going to go and account for every, and the King James says idle, for every idle word, which is really kind of a poor translation. It's really, just worthless, useless word. If you're just spouting a bunch of ungodly stuff and disobedient stuff, then there's going to be an account for that, which is actually where I didn't know we'd spend so much time on this, but we'll keep moving. But this is actually sort of where we're going as we keep going in Ecclesiastes 12. Is it okay if we move on?
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
This is really interesting, but so I just want to see if I got this right. That when it refers to the dead, then it's really referring to the no longer existent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, if you're theoretically, if you like, for example, Abraham, I would say is no longer existent. 4,000 years. We just haven't got anything that'll preserve a body like that. For some people, we have skeletons hanging around and stuff like that. But as far as the person goes, yeah, the person is gone. They no longer exist. They are in the mind of God.
Can I mention one thing?
Sure.
And I learned this in college in philosophy, psychology, or criminal. And this is why this is so delivering to a lot of people that the dead are dead, is because they've proven that a lot of people that commit suicide for one reason or another will kill their children so they will be in heaven with them. It's pretty sad.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for bringing that up, because you're exactly right. There was actually a case of that in Indianapolis a few years ago where a man was going through a very bloody divorce, and he asked his children, do you want to be in heaven with daddy? And they said yes, and he killed them and then killed himself. There's various deleterious things to believing that when you die, you're actually alive in some form. One of them is that you run into as you start taking classes on pastoral counseling. There is a statistical percentage of women that will not have sex after their mother dies, because they were fine until they thought their mother could see them. And they're like, I can't make love to you. My mom's watching. So, then you got to wiggle through that one as a pastor. So that anyway, we'll move on. So then after and then he concludes kind of the section, utterly pointless, says the sage, utterly pointless, which is almost exactly the same in the Hebrew as Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2. There's some minor differences, but that's basically kind of wrapping up the chapter or the book. And then so you have this kind of epilogue, which starts in verse 9. And furthermore, because the sage was wise, he also taught the people knowledge. He pondered, evaluated, and arranged many proverbs. And so this is, if the sage did this to put the proverbs in place, then this kind of leads us, where do we want to be when we're reading the poetic books, when we're reading Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, for example. We want to make sure we're not reading them like a prose book, just like a buzzsaw, yeah, I got that one done, type of thing. But we ponder and we evaluate in the wording of the Proverbs. The way they're worded is very important. And then I think verse 10, and Bill and I had quite a talk about this, because you have verse 9 where the sage is teaching and he's arranging and he's setting these orders in Proverbs. But then beyond that, verse 10, the sage is doing what we're all doing, which is we're searching for true wisdom in other places as well. So verse 10, the sage sought to find delightful words and what was written uprightly, words of truth, because wisdom literature, particularly, you think about Solomon, and he's writing, say, 900 plus BC. Well, there's other godly men. I mean, Job had spoken godly things. Moses had spoken godly things. Joshua, Samuel, there were lots of godly people, and not just godly Hebrews, but some other godly people. And there's wisdom literature from other cultures. And so where God had worked in those people. And so I think it's interesting that it says the sage sought to find delightful words and what was written uprightly, words of truth. And so it's interesting that then you see, for example, in the book of Proverbs, we look at Proverbs in the book of Kings, in 1 Kings chapter 4, it says that Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, but there aren't even 1,000 proverbs in the book of Proverbs. In fact, if I remember my count correctly, it's 915 individual proverbs, and that includes the ones that have been doubled. In other words, if you count the 31 chapters, you get a little more than that, but some of the proverbs have been doubled. So Solomon, the sage, knew a whole bunch of proverbs, and some of them weren't his. Some of them he borrowed from other sources of wisdom literature, and that's what we do. You know, if I find a good quotation, I say I steal it. You know, I stole that from so and so, or I stole that from so and so, and there's great good wisdom out there. In verse 10, the sage sought to find delightful words, and I got a kick out of this because as Bill and I were going through the commentaries and looking at stuff, several of the commentators made the point that they were surprised that the sage would look for delightful words, because there were so many words, so many messages in Ecclesiastes that weren't delightful, that they had a fairly hard message. Like, you know, there's one event to men and animals, you die, you know, and life is pointless and life is full of toil and that type of thing. And they were kind of like, well, if he sought for delightful words, then why aren't his words always delightful? And the answer to that, the interesting thing is that the answer to that is kind of right in front of your face if you understand what is truly delightful. You see, to the educated conscience, the message that brings you closer to truth and closer to God is delightful, even if it hurts at first. Can you guys think of a place in the scripture where it talks about, yeah, you're right on it, James. You got it. How about Hebrews? Let's take a quick look at Hebrews chapter 12. So let's see, Hebrews 12. And he's talking about sons. Verse 7 is for discipline and guidance that you must continue to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? And then it goes on, we have earthly fathers that disciplined us. And then in verse 11, and indeed all discipline seems at the present time not to be joyous, but painful. Yet afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And that's what's going on with the delightful words. Sometimes they hurt, and that's going to come up in the very next verse. So here is verse 10 saying, the sage sought to find delightful words in what is written uprightly, words of truth. And then he goes right on and says, yeah, the words of the wise, well, you know, they're like goads. You know, they're like goads. They're like nails fastened, and like nails well fastened. And you know, you guys know what a goad is. A goad is a long stick. Usually they were probably at least 8 feet. And the man who was plowing, the plowman would have his plow, and then he would have this stick, and it usually had to be at least 8 feet, and it had a point on it. And so he's got the cow, and as the cow got older and got trained, the farmer, the plowman, he didn't have to much mess with the cow. He could just talk to it. But when the cows were young, you know, they'd want to go wandering off, and then the guy'd take the goat and he'd poke the cow, and eventually the cow'd get upset about this and start to kick. And then you'd hold the goat right behind his legs, and he'd kick up into it and hurt himself. And that's what Jesus Christ said to Paul when he says, is it hard for you to kick against the pricks? Meaning, you know, you've been stubborn and kicking at me, and now you're getting yourself hurt. And so Christ challenged Paul with that. So it's interesting that in the very verse, in verse 10, the sage seeks to find delightful words. And then in verse 11, he says, yeah, well, those words, they're like goads. And I think this is something that we need to educate people on, because we live in this modern culture where every message is supposed to make me feel good. And if what I say doesn't make you feel good, I'm not being loving. You know, somebody goes to a church where they hear a message that's pretty, pretty sharp about, look, if you're not obeying God, there's going to be consequences. Well, that church wasn't very loving. Well, yeah, actually, that was the most loving church, but you don't have a conscience that's educated enough to even understand love when you see it. And that's got to be part of the pastoral counseling and the pastoral call. I confess I'm not the most patient person to sit down and talk to somebody who's not getting it. But there's plenty of called pastors and encouragers in the body that have infinite patience to sit with people like that and just kind of bring them along at their pace. And that's one of the reasons that pastors and encouragers and mercy givers are so important in the body of Christ. And the body of Christ, we wouldn't win many people if everybody was like me. You'd be like, I'm tired. Figure it out on your own. But anyway, so the words of the wise are like goads. And then as we learn these words and have them in our heart, then we can help people too. And interestingly, this was a little challenging to figure out what was going on here. But the words of the wise are like goads, and like nails well fastened. Words of, and then the Hebrew is masters of collections. And in the Hebrew text, the master of the collection is the man who's like me. He's kind of surrounded by books and collections of literature, and he's mastered them, and he's assimilated them, and he's able to bring the chewy caramel center to the surface here and get to the heart of what's going on. So the words of the wise are like goads, they're like nails well fastened. They're the words of masters of collections, the sages, the scholars who have seen the information and sorted it out and gotten to the chewy caramel center, and that's what that's talking about. And then, and I love verse 11 too, where it finishes by saying, given by one shepherd. Because if the words, it doesn't matter if the wise words, back here in the biblical world, you might have a wise man come out of Ethiopia, another one come out of Egypt, there's Solomon out of Israel. You might have had a couple of the Magi come out of the area of Eastern Babylon, that kind of thing. And you get these men who are the masters of collections, and they've got all this wisdom, and then they collate this stuff and get it out to people. And Solomon is learning from them and assimilating that information. And that's what we do when we read Proverbs and we read the works of other wise men, but given by one shepherd, because the Bible is very clear that God is the font of true wisdom, that all true wisdom comes from him. And so when you get these different masters of collections together and they're sharing their wisdom, if it's true wisdom, it's all going to fit, it's all going to agree. And that would make perfect sense because there's one God who's behind it. And Proverbs chapter 2, 6 and following. We've got time to go there. Let's go to Proverbs 2, verse 6. And in Proverbs 2, 6, verse 6, for Yahweh gives wisdom. From his mouth comes forth knowledge and discernment. He has stored up sound advice for the upright and is a shield for those who walk blamelessly, guarding the paths of justice, watching over the way of his loyal ones. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and integrity, every good path. In other words, if we learn our wisdom from God, then we understand what's righteous and what's just and what's upright. And that's what the scripture is saying here in Ecclesiastes 12 about their words from one shepherd. And then verse 12, back to Ecclesiastes 12, verse 12 then is really interesting in light of verse 11, because it says, my son, beware of anything beyond these. And this is always a challenge because in verse 11 and through Ecclesiastes, what we've learned and from Proverbs, God is the font of wisdom, and he's given this wisdom, and it's there for us. But the world has totally different systems. And so here you have the words of the wise, and the wise are speaking, and those wise words are like goads, and they keep us on the straight and narrow path. And then the father admonishes his son, my son. And it's interesting because this is the only time in Proverbs my son appears. And all of, it occurs a lot in Proverbs, you see it in Psalms, but this is the only time in Ecclesiastes it appears. And so it has a kind of an extra weight here where the father just says, my son, beware. And you can see the love of the father pouring out here. He's concerned for his young son who might be kind of swooped up and taken aside and attracted by the fables and the genealogies and the stories in the other religions, and the God and the glitz. And he says, you've got these wise words, my son, beware of anything beyond them. And the New Testament says very much the same thing. If we take a look, for example, Titus 1:9. Let's go charging through the New Testament just a little bit. In Titus chapter 1, Paul is writing to Titus, and he says, he's talking about an overseer in verse 7, blameless and that kind of thing. And then verse 9, firmly holding the faithful word as he has been taught. And that was such an important thing because there's so many pressures, the guy writes the novel, The Da Vinci Code, and the next thing you know, everybody thinks Mary Magdalene and Jesus were secretly married. I mean, the undisciplined mind of man just goes running off on all kinds of, gosh, if you want to protect yourself, you need to buy a dream catcher. And if you want good luck, you got to buy a rabbit's foot. And if you want, it's so easy to get dragged off into fables and stuff. 1 Timothy chapter 1, let's go there. And one of the things I loved about reading that in Ecclesiastes was as I was reading it, I was recognizing immediately, wow, this is the same basic instruction that God gave the leaders in the New Testament. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, as Paul writes to Timothy, as I urged you when I was going into Macedonia, stay at Ephesus, so that you can instruct certain people not to teach a different doctrine, nor to occupy themselves with fables and endless genealogies, which give rise to speculation rather than furthering the administration of God. And if you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, and starting in verse 2, he said, preach the word. And then in verse 3, for the time will come when they will not put up with sound teaching, but having itching ears will heap to themselves teachers to suit their own desires, and they'll turn away from the truth and turn to fables. And that's exactly the kind of thing that the sage here is warning his son about in Ecclesiastes. He's saying, look, you've got the words of the wise. You've got them. Beware of anything beyond them. And that, boy, those words should ring so loudly in our culture because we have so many wild distractions. And then he's going to talk about some of these distractions in Ecclesiastes. Of the making of many books, there's no end. And much study is a weariness of the flesh. And it's not study in the sense of studying the word. It's in the context of Ecclesiastes, looking for those answers for which there is no answer. There's that verse that God put eternity in the hearts of man, but they can't find out what God is doing, but they want to. And so they go charging off into the netherworld. So verse 13, this is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Now, obviously, there's a hyperbole. What he means when he says all has been heard is you've heard everything you need to know to be successful. You're fine. You're going to be successful. And he distills it down to fear God and keep his commandments. And after this, the Hebrew, And Bill and I debated back and forth, do we keep the Hebrew or do we embellish it a little bit? Because the Hebrew is very simple. It says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the all of humankind. It's the all, that's it. You want to know Lord, what do I do? Lord, where do I go? Lord, what do I need? The all of humankind is literally fear God and keep his commandments. And as we looked at it and read the commentaries, the majority translation is something like, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of humankind. But that's pretty cold and forensic. It's like God gave you a duty, and your duty is to fear God and keep his commandments. And it's much more than that. God created us so he could love us, so we would love him, so we could fellowship with him, we could be with him, he could be with us. He created us for a purpose, and it wasn't to be little producers who had a duty. It was to be with him, understand him, know him, love each other, love God, love your neighbor like yourself, the two commandments. And it's really, so he says, fear God, which is, to understand who he is and reverence him and understand his awesomeness and also his power, from which we get a little bit of fear. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the all of mankind. That's the whole purpose. And in that light, this can become a bit of a hard message for people because in today's world, people want to do their own thing. What, you mean by me ignoring God? God's got a problem with that? Yes, he does. You mean that just if I just go and do what I want to, God's got a problem with that? Yes, he does. Why? Well, because he didn't create you so you could do your own thing. He created you so you could fellowship with him, love him. He could love you. He didn't create you so he could watch you go off like a top in any old direction you wanted to. And people don't get that. And it's a very hard message about Gehenna. But if you take a look at, for example, just go to Matthew. Let's just take a look at a couple verses about Gehenna. And I think that the Bible really did, some of the ancient translators like the King James really did a disservice in translating the Greek word Gehenna as hell, especially when people kind of come, by 1611, the image of Dante's Inferno with people boiling in mud upside down and stuff like that was so firmly embedded in people's minds that when you translated Gehenna as hell, it created a surrealistic, very unbelievable scenario and made God seem really horrible and stuff like that. But for example, if you look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, and Christ is talking about obeying God, and he says, and if your right eye causes you to fall, from you fall away from God, pluck it out and throw it from you, for it's better for you that one of your members perish than that your whole body be thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to fall, cut it off and throw it away from you, for it's better for you that one of your members should perish than that your whole body go into Gehenna. Now, when Christ is there teaching, and I've taught this before, so you guys probably know this, but the word Gehenna is a Greek word that's built from two words in Hebrew. You can go all the way back to Joshua chapter 15, where the Valley of Hinnom, which was the south border of Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom, and the word valley in Hebrew is Geh, G-E, and the man's name was Hinnom, and he was the man who owned the valley. And so it was called Gehenna in the same way that Gary's house is called Gary's house, because he owns it. So it was the Valley of Hinnom. Sometimes in the Old Testament, after Hinnom died, you'll see it called the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom, the Geh Ben Hinnom, because Hinnom died and then his sons got the valley. So the interesting thing is that because the valley was south of Jerusalem, it became used for royal things, and then by the time of Jeremiah, it was being used for human sacrifice. And you can read about that in Jeremiah 7, and there's a couple other places. So because it was used for human sacrifices, and particularly the sacrifice of babies, the whole valley became unclean to the people. And because the valley was unclean, and it was also helpful that the valley was downhill, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which became the largest city in Israel, so the inhabitants of Jerusalem would all take their garbage and throw it into Gehenna, and then they'd light it on fire. And so the valley of Gehenna had garbage, it had fires, it had rats, it had maggots, and the garbage would just kind of, they'd keep, it's a big city, and they'd keep throwing their garbage there, and the garbage would keep burning and keep getting eaten by rats and maggots and that kind of thing. And everybody in Jerusalem understood what Gehenna was. It was the garbage dump. And if we understand that, see, it seems like a very cold message, but here's Christ. Christ is like, look, if in the sum and substance of things, you as a human being are not going to be valuable to God, he's going to throw you out with the garbage. I mean, that's what Gehenna was. It was a garbage dump. The world, the devil has this dialogue, this societal pressure, societal dialogue going on that you're a human being, you're valuable to God. Not if you don't make yourself valuable to God. Human beings aren't valuable to God. Human beings, as Christ taught, are going to get thrown into Gehenna, into the garbage dump. Why? Because they haven't made themselves valuable to God. So God created us with a purpose. And then we fulfill that purpose in today's administration by getting saved and then living obedient lives. And that's where, then you go back to Ecclesiastes 12. And so he says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the all of mankind. This is the whole gig. This is your whole life's work and purpose and essence is to be in a relationship with God. So we translated the whole purpose of mankind and put purpose in italics. But I think this is, I don't even think I'm capturing it well enough because it lives bigger in my heart than I'm able to say it, that God so loved us that he created us and he wanted all of us. He didn't want a piece of us, a part of us. He didn't want some of our time. He wants my whole life. He wants my whole heart. He wants my whole mind. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole ball of wax for me. And it's got to be for people. And then as you do that, all of a sudden you find out that wow, as I move into God's world, God so loves me that he releases me to be me. So the most profound release is in obedience to God and giving yourself totally to God, while trying to hang on to who I am makes me smaller and smaller, because we weren't designed to be able to do that. We were designed to get our energy and our life and our purpose and our feeling of safety and security and love. We love because he first loved us. We get to be who we are for real because we give it all to him first. And as soon as I see giving myself to him as some kind of bad thing and I'm going to keep it and be my own self, I become very small and very tight and very insecure because I'm not very good on my own. God didn't design us to be. So that's really what this is going. And then verse 14 simply wraps it up. For God will bring everything we do into judgment, including, I like this, including every hidden thing. So we're not going to be able to hide anything, whether it is good or whether it's evil. There is going to be a judgment day. And if we've given our all to him, then that judgment day will be a time of rejoicing. And like Peter said, that we have a rich welcome into the kingdom. I don't know what exactly a rich welcome is going to, what it's going to consist of, but I know I'm excited about it. Just, wow, you get a rich welcome into the kingdom. That's pretty cool. So that's a lot of stuff tonight to share, and I really appreciate you guys being with me.